感谢各位参加中央研究院特别讲座。现在我们请科技部人文及社会科学研究发展司肖高燕司长为我们主持这场演讲。Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to Academia Sinica Special Lecture. It is our great pleasure to have the Director General of the Department of Humanities and Social Sciences at the Ministry of Science and Technology, Professor Xiao Gaoyan, moderate today's lecture. Please join me in welcoming Professor Xiao.
Professor Sunstein, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, good afternoon. It's a great honor for me to have this opportunity to introduce Professor K. Sunstein for his second Academia Sinica special lecture. Professor Sunstein is the Robert Wormsley University Professor at Harvard University, and before this distinctive position, he was the Distinguished Service Professor at Law School of University of Chicago for more than 20 years, and between the year 2009 and 12, he served as an administrator of Office of Information and Regulatory Affairs. Professor Sunstein is the most distinctive scholar engaged in the cutting-edge interdisciplinary research based on legal theory, behavioral economics, and political philosophy. And moreover, he is capable of deploying his findings in theoretical research in the contemporary social political issues and become one of the most prominent public intellectuals in the United States. And for example, in 2008, Professor Sunstein, together with the economist Robert Toller, co-authored a book entitled Nudge: Improving Decision About Health, Wealth, and Happiness, which is a New York Times bestseller, and according to the Amazon record, more than 750,000 copies were sold. Last year, Professor Sunstein followed up a more theoretical book, Why Nudge? The Politics of Libertarian Paternalism, which was the Storrs Lectures series he delivered at Yale University. In this book, he elaborates a version of libertarian paternalism and defend it against the orthodox liberalism, especially John Stuart Mill's harm principle, which contends that only in potential damages to others could the government restrict individuals' freedom of choice. Based on the new findings in behavioral economics, Professor Sunstein suggests that government could design a mechanism to nudge individuals' choice of architecture, which you have learned a lot this morning. And now, Professor Sunstein will engage his theory with another important tradition of Western political philosophy, that is civic republicanism, which shapes the modern idea of autonomy. Now, ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming Professor Sunstein to deliver his speech.
Okay, thank you so much. I see some familiar faces. So some of you were here earlier, and for those of you who weren't here earlier, I'll try to make this one better than the last one. This is going to be an effort to connect the civic Republican tradition with recent work in behavioral science and with, I think, some of the more fundamental questions in human life. So I'm going to try to connect some ideas about self-government and republicanism with some of the new research. We'll see if the connection works. There's the human condition that in the last week, there were many questions everyone in this room had to ask, one of which was, do I come to this lecture? Another of which was, what will I do with my Saturday night? Another is, what fundamental choice will I make about the course of my life within the next years? If you didn't ask that question in the last week, well, you'll probably ask it at some point before terribly long. So each of us is in a position of facing those question marks. Here's a story from a novelist. There are two young fish swimming along, and they happen to meet an older fish swimming the other way, who nods at them and says, "Morning, boys, how's the water?" And the two young fish swim on for a bit, and then eventually one of them looks over at the other and goes, "What the hell is water?" That seems to me an illuminating story, because all of us are living in a world which has the equivalent of water. The design of this classroom, for example, the layout of our streets, the design of this institute, the design of the city of Taipei. Those are for us water, and we take them often as background facts. We don't focus so much on what it is doing for or to us. Okay, my goals here are first to explore the value of choice and the idea of choosing not to choose. Sometimes the choose not to choose is a good choice, and sometimes it is a path to freedom. The basic idea is first that each of us has limited time, and if we choose not to choose, that enables us to devote our limited time to the matters that seem to us most important. That's a way that we promote freedom. Sometimes we choose not to choose because there's someone, it may be a trusted advisor, it may be a government official, it may be a parent, it might be a professor, to whom we defer because we trust that they can choose better than we can. When we choose not to choose, we exercise our freedom, and when we choose not to choose, we sometimes make ourselves more free. But that's not always true. So the question is, when is it true? My second goal is to connect the analysis of freedom of choice and its limits with the tradition of civic republicanism. Well, the foundations of freedom of choice have three faces. There are three different ideas. The first, associated with the utilitarian tradition and John Stuart Mill, is that people know best about what is in their interests, and outsiders are unlikely to have the information they have. I mean to use Mill's argument as not a narrowly Western idea, but an idea that each of us feels at some points, at least in our lives. And my guess is that in the Confucian and Buddhist traditions, there are analogs, at least, to Mill's way of thinking, where the idea is that we have our own values and tastes, and sometimes, at least, we know better than outsiders how to promote those values and realize those tastes. So if we care about human well-being, we might prize freedom of choice. The second idea involves dignity, and here Immanuel Kant is the great Western thinker. And the simple notion is that people ought not to be humiliated. They should be treated as ends and not as means. And that a respect for freedom of choice is a way of respecting individual dignity. So any society that overrides people's capacity to make their own choices at least risks invading dignity. The third idea has to do not with dignity, but with autonomy. And here the notion is that it is sometimes a harm to force people to go in a direction that they don't want to go. That doesn't treat people with respect, and coercion can be an intrusion on autonomy. So we can think of the idea of freedom of choice as having three theoretical foundations, and these are the three. Okay, republicanism in its Roman and British forms often sees self-government as a reflection of autonomy. Civic virtue and the willingness to participate in public affairs is a centrally prized feature of the Republican tradition, where the notion is self-government requires a kind of active citizenry in which people express their freedom through helping to govern themselves. That's an important element of the civic Republican tradition. There are two ideas that we can put in modern form that have a Republican foundation. The first is people don't only have preferences, they also have preferences about their preferences. So you may prefer to eat, let's say, unhealthy food, but you may wish you didn't. Or you may prefer certain ways of acting in society, but you may prefer that you had better preferences. So each of us has preferences, but also scrutinizes our own preferences and sometimes think we wish we were different. That is an idea that, in its own form, the Republican tradition emphasizes insofar as it stresses people's exercise of virtue rather than their deference to their own passions. So you can see the emphasis on virtue and the concern about passions as being, in some ways, about preferences. Some economists speak now, and this was at one point a very radical idea, it's still not exactly conventional, but to say that sometimes our preferences are an artifact of the situation in which we find ourselves. A great historian of the American Revolution wrote of the United States before our revolution as a very hierarchical society in which people who were low in terms of status or economics would treat those who were above them with great deference, and they would show no rebellion against their lowly status. They were used to it. It was what they lived with. And the idea is that if we live in a society that prizes certain forms of deference, then that will be our own preference. That may be good or fine, but it's just a reflection of the fact that what we prefer and what we value reflects the society in which we live, and the view that we should just respect preferences may be undermined if it turns out preferences are an artifact of an unjust society. Yes? Okay, so the story of Ulysses and the sirens, where Ulysses tries to resist the sirens by sticking things in his ear so he can't hear them, that's, I think, connected with an aspect of the Republican tradition which values, again, virtue over passions. The Republican tradition raises potential problems for simple freedom of choice in areas where people smoke, discriminate, and maybe pollute the environment without acting virtuously. Okay, here are some examples of choosing not to choose. There's evidence that in some countries, maybe this is one, patients want doctors to make choices for them. And insofar as doctors are saying to patients, what do you want? Patients don't welcome that question. They want the doctor to give a recommendation. It may be that in some nations, the interest in patient autonomy, putting all choices in the hands of the patient, actually is inconsistent with the patient's own desire, which is to put choice in the hands of the doctor. With respect to health plans and retirement plans, in many countries, there is an interest in making people choose. What health plan or retirement plan do you want? But some people choose not to choose. They want someone who knows something to make decisions for them. With respect to privacy, many people care greatly about making their own choice, but some people think, give me an option on the internet, and I will respect that. I want not to choose. In the area of shopping, there's some evidence, I have some evidence, I might even give you the evidence I have, that people would like to choose less. They would choose not to choose. They would like choices to be made for them by someone who knows. Could we have default rules, meaning choices for us, that reflect Republican ideals? I think we could. we could have chosen through the political process, reflecting a process of deliberation and reason-giving, protection of social aspirations, say to equal treatment, that reflects unselfish values and that are encoded in the acts of our government. Of course, we always have to be wary that our government will be mistaken or corrupt or not have our interests at heart. But if the democracy is working well and the representatives are accountable to people and there's a process of deliberation too, then giving the government some authority, at least to create default rules for us, might be the right choice. Okay, why do default rules really matter? By default rules, what I mean is a rule that specifies what happens if the chooser does nothing. If you have a default rule in place, you can easily choose not to choose. So if you look at the default settings on your computer or your relationship with your employer, there will be default rules that allow you not to think about it. That is reflecting, for those who prefer not to choose, the choice not to choose. There is an important question, which is why are default rules so influential? Why do they tend to stick? There seem to be three different ideas. One is whatever default rules the legal system or a company or the government establishes works because people show inertia and they won't change the default rule because they're busy. I'll give you a little example. At a government organization in Europe, they decided as an experiment to turn down the thermometers in winter by 1 degree centigrade. So the default setting was 1 degree centigrade lower. And it turned out that that lower temperature default saved a lot of money. People didn't turn it up. They relied on the default. One reason they relied on the default was inertia. To go over and change the thermometer, who wants to do that? People they're doing their work. Inertia often leads people to stick with the default. The second idea is that the default rule often has information in it. So if there is a default setting on your cell phone, you might think someone who knows what the default setting should be devised that default setting, and you won't change it unless you have clarity that your own judgment is superior. There's a lot of information in the default rules that institutions set up, and people respect that information. They won't change it unless they're pretty clear it's wrong. It's also the case that people are loss averse. They don't like losses from the status quo, and the default rule establishes the status quo. If people are pondering whether to change the default rule, they might think, I don't want to incur a loss, and if I change the default rule, I will incur a loss. Here are two examples of the power of default rules. First, with respect to end-of-life care, and this is a very important issue, the government could say the default rule is that you will, if you have no prospects, you will have a comfortable early end of your life, and there will be no effort to prolong your life. And people could be asked, do you want to change that? The evidence suggests that that default tends to stick. Or the default could be, there will be efforts made to prolong your life as long as technology permits. Do you want to change that? People tend not to want to change that. So whatever the default rule is, tends for many people to be determinative. That's significant. For environmental matters, exactly the same is true. If people have clean energy by default, they tend to stay clean, even if they could change it. They choose not to choose. If they have cheaper but less clean energy by default, they stay with that also. Do people dislike being defaulted? Most of the evidence so far is they don't. They welcome a default rule. Okay, that's the power of defaults. So this is a problem. Individuals often choose not to choose. Probably in the next week you're going to choose not to choose. in some important domains, and that's not because you came to this talk. It's just how human beings are. That can be rational. It can be more rational to choose not to choose than to choose, partly because we may overrate autonomy. That is, we may make mistakes in choosing too much, and partly because when we choose not to choose, we reduce the burden on our limited mental bandwidth. Okay, I think to make this more concrete, I'm going to give you a personal example and then some data, which I just got within the last week. The personal example is, in New York City, where I live most of the time, once you get in a taxi and you're going to the airport, the taxi driver asks you, which route would you like to take? I hate that question. I have no idea, and the driver is the expert. So I always say, you choose. Give you another personal example. I have a very good friend who works on these issues, and we were deciding where to go to lunch. And I said, anything's fine with me, why don't you choose? And he said, that's a very bad answer. It's always good to make a proposal. Okay, the data is a study I've been working on for the last months asked people at the University College London, students at the University of College London, to participate in a game by which they can make investments, and they can choose either to choose themselves to make investments, or they can choose not to choose and have someone else make an investment for them. Now, the trick in the study is they are given data as the game continues about their own likelihood of making a good investment, and also about the likelihood that their colleague is making a good investment. So they're getting very clear data in real time about their performance as opposed to the performance of the person who they might choose for them. They're also getting data in real time which they're providing about their own perceptions of how likely they are to make a good investment. What we found is that people systematically choose too much, that they choose in circumstances in which they know, they have the information, they should be deferring to someone else. There's a systematic tendency for choosers to be losers. I just wrote this morning, I'm a little jet lagged, so I just wrote this morning the first paragraph of this paper, and that's the title, unless you tell me it shouldn't be, When Choosers Are Losers. And choosers are losers because they systematically overchoose and lose money as a result in circumstances in which they have the data, which shows that that's a mistake. Okay, here are some facts and some judgments. It is a form of paternalism to override people's choices, including the choice not to choose. So if people want to choose not to choose, to forbid them from doing so is a form of paternalism. Societies systematically face a question, which is to structure situations so that people make active choices, so that they have impersonal default rules, meaning a default rule that everyone in this room is presented with, or personalized default rules in which everyone in this room has a different default rule that fits your circumstance. So societies now and increasingly have to ask, and this is true for private and public institutions both, do we say you must choose? Do we say here's the default rule, if you don't like it, change it? Or do we say here's your default rule, here's your default rule, and you can change it, but we've designed one specifically for you? That's a systematic puzzle. The test I'm suggesting should involve decision costs and error costs. So if this isn't clear, let me spell it out a little bit. The economic analysis of the law, in my view, has had one great idea and probably 1,000 good ideas. But it's had one great idea. The great idea is that if you're stuck in a problem You don't know exactly how to handle it. Think about decision costs and error costs. That is a great idea. So if you're trying to figure out whether to have active choosing for cell phone settings, that would impose big decision costs on people. When they buy a cell phone, they have to choose all the default settings. Then you'd never get out of the store. And also, since so many of the default settings involve technical expertise, at least I would make many mistakes, so let the expert do it. That's a setting where the cost of decision and the cost of errors suggests choose not to choose, defaults. On the other hand, if you're going to a restaurant that you visit and enjoy, and it has 9 items on the menu, and you know which of them you like, then active choosing is best. Maybe the choice among the options is enjoyable, and if someone defaulted you into one of the 9, they'd make mistakes. You know what you like. And that's an inquiry into costs of decisions and costs of errors. That's our test. Okay, what I've said so far is pretty abstract. And I'm going to get a little less abstract now and then get more concrete. So if you bear with me, I have 4 large claims. The first is impersonal default rules are better than active choosing when the context is confusing and unfamiliar, people would prefer not to choose, learning is not important, and the population is not heterogeneous along any relevant dimension. So there's a lot packed in that slide, but the idea is a general default rule for some policy or some interaction with an institution or for savings or for the environment makes sense when the context is confusing and unfamiliar, so that people aren't going to be able to figure out what the right outcome is. People don't want to choose, learning is unimportant, and the population doesn't have a lot of diversity in it. Those are the conditions where we want a default rule rather than active choosing. I'm thinking a little bit, there's a room upstairs where kindly I was given a little rest earlier today. And right near the towels, there's a behaviorally very intelligent note. The note says, most people here choose not to have their towels changed every day. Our default is the towels will not be changed every day. If you want your towels changed, just tell us. That's this slide. That's exactly this slide. It's an impersonal default rule. Do I want my towels chosen every day? I don't know. That's confusing and unfamiliar. Would I prefer not to choose? Yes, I would prefer not to choose. Learning is not important. I don't need to learn a lot about towels. And the population of people who use that room, it isn't heterogeneous along any relevant dimension. Yes? That's a condition where the impersonal default rule makes sense. Okay, but there's a qualification. Even when those conditions are met, we need to be able to trust the choice architect to produce sensible default rules. If the rules are harmful or dumb, it would be best to insist on active choosing. So if the hotel is just, their towels are dirty and they're going to make you sick, you're going to get a disease, they're being cruel or mischievous, then the default rule wouldn't be good. I trust the hotel room, by the way. Okay, second claim. Active choosing is better than impersonal default rules when choice architects are biased or lack important information, the context is familiar, people would actually prefer to choose, and hence choice is a benefit rather than a cost, learning matters, and there's relevant heterogeneity. Okay, there's a lot there also. It's abstract. Let me try to bring it down to earth. My father enjoyed investments. I don't know if he was good at it, but he wasn't bad at it. He enjoyed thinking, which stock should I invest in? He liked it. For him, choosing was a benefit rather than a cost. For him, the context was very familiar. He spent a lot of time on this. He liked learning, and he was different from other people. Active choosing for him, excellent. In an area, at least in the United States, where there's considerable controversy, that is organ donation, you could have a default rule that says everyone is presumed to be an organ donor, as many countries have. You could have a default rule that says people are not organ donors unless they opt in. Or you could say, if you're going to get a driver's license, you have to say, active choosing. There are some advantages to active choosing, at least on ground 3 and ground 5. People prefer to choose. A lot of people do. And there's heterogeneity. Some people have strong values that suggest they don't want to be organ donors. Some people suggest they do. These are the conditions for active choosing. Third claim. Personalized default rules are better to impersonal ones where there is relevant heterogeneity. When one size does not fit all, we should have more than one size. If we know that a retirement plan that suits people under 40 wouldn't be sensible for people over 60, we should try to personalize retirement plans. Okay, this is the most future-oriented of the slides. It has some music accompanying the text, and the music is that personalized default rules we will increasingly see as private and public institutions know more about you or about your demographic, and they are in a position to design a choice for you that fits your situation. Personalized default rules have major advantages over active choosing because they produce benefits in terms of accuracy without requiring people to devote time and effort to choosing. So the great advantage of active choosing over a default rule is that it's more accurate. But if you have a personalized default rule, which says your situation calls for this, then we can achieve accuracy. Okay, Republicanism again. Okay, we can test the various claims, the 4 claims I've made, through a deliberative process at the level of government, which fits with Republican ideals. We can connect some understandings of Republicanism with modern behavioral science by pointing to the distinction between System 1 and System 2. Is this familiar, System 1 and System 2? System 1 is the part of the human mind that thinks very rapidly and intuitively and sometimes makes mistakes. System 2 is the part of the human mind that thinks more slowly and deliberatively and is more likely to be accurate, though it's slower. I'll give you some data which I think is extremely revealing and highly relevant. The errors that human beings make that are System 1 type errors, rapid judgment errors, people don't make when they're answering in a language that isn't their first language. Amazing, yes? That people who speak French will make certain mistakes in French that they won't make in German. Germans will make certain mistakes in German that they won't make in English. Why is that? That suggests that for those of you for whom English is a second language, you're not going to make any mistakes. And the reason is that when you are thinking or speaking in a language that's not your first language, you're in System 2. Your intuitions aren't in charge. You are deliberating and reflecting. And that means the mistakes won't be made. Okay, an idea is that the Republican tradition sees government, when it's designed well, as System 2. It is not the momentary passions and the intuitions driving judgment. It's a deliberative process in which reason is in charge. So the Republican distinction between reason and passion maps onto a belief that government, when it's working well, doesn't show passions. Okay, choice requiring paternalism. If a government requires people to make choices when they choose not to choose, then it is acting paternalistically. So under circumstances in which people prefer not to choose, a mandatory choice is a form of paternalism. Now, I think I should explain why this seems to me important to assert. I wrote a book a few years ago with my great economist friend Richard Thaler called Nudge. There have been many criticisms of the book. Some of them aren't maybe the most convincing criticisms, but there is one tremendous criticism, and it's by someone from the United Kingdom named Riccardo Rebinato. And what Riccardo Rebinato argues in his book is that nudges aren't good because it's paternalistic even to use a default rule when people should be active choosers. So Rebinato says, he's very much in the tradition of John Stuart Mill, part of the British tradition of liberalism, people should be actively choosers. And nudges don't make people active choosers. Okay, that's a powerful objection. I'm trying to respond to that objection by saying if people choose not to choose, then to override that choice is itself a form of paternalism. And people often choose not to choose. If we're concerned about welfare and dignity and autonomy, then to prevent people from choosing not to choose is objectionable on every one of those three grounds. If people choose not to choose, thinking, I want someone else to make the decision for me because they know better, then it intrudes on the chooser's welfare to force them to choose. And it is an insult to their dignity and a violation of autonomy to make them choose. So this is a suggestion that in circumstances in which citizens are voluntarily not choosers, when they say to the doctor, choose for me, or the cab driver, you do the route, for the person to insist, the doctor or the cab driver, no, you choose, is an intrusion on their autonomy and a form of choice requiring paternalism. Okay. Now what I'm going to try to do is make things very hard for my argument. I'm making a Republican-inspired argument in favor of choosing not to choose. I'm going to try to make things very difficult for myself. There's a book called Brave New World by Aldous Huxley. It's a warning about a society that's disrespectful of freedom. The hero of the book is called the Savage, and he's surrounded by comfortable defaults. And he says, but I don't want comfort. I want God. I want poetry. I want real danger. I want freedom. I want goodness. I want sin. You can see that as a novelized version of Mill. Okay, here's a defense of active choosing. There are German social scientists right now, very active theorists, who are saying we shouldn't have nudges, we should have boosts. Boosts, B-O-O-S-T-S. And the idea, instead of nudging people, we should boost their own capacities. This is a very interesting idea. The claim is what government should be doing in the 21st century is not helping people to choose not to choose, but it should be using forms of choice architecture so that people can exercise their own agency. Sometimes that's correct. So if you have a context where learning is very important, whether it involves health or economic matters, then the argument for active choosing is strong. If we think that government or doctors or lawyers are bad choice architects, that's a good objection to choosing not to choose. If we think that people's situations change over time, or there is heterogeneity and diversity, then we might think active choosing is very important because otherwise the default rule is going to produce mistakes. And if we think that we want to overcome inertia by figuring out what people really want, then there's a strong argument for active choosing. Now I want to go down the mountain. It's not clear which is the promised land, but I want to make at least that ambiguous. Here's just some oral comments from MIT economist Esther Duflo. She's a student of development. She says, we tend to be patronizing about the poor in a very specific sense, which is that we tend to think, why don't they take more responsibility for their lives? That might be more in the United States than here, but it's not limited to the United States. But what we are forgetting is the richer you are, the less responsibility you need to take for your own life because everything is taken care for you. And the poorer you are, the more you have to be responsible about everything about your life. Now, I think there's real significance in this claim because the claim is that people who are struggling under very difficult circumstances, one of the problems is that they have choice overload. To drink clean water, to find a doctor, to get from one place to another involves a multitude of choices, which are extremely difficult and time-consuming to make. My observation of Taipei is that to find clean water, to have breathable air, to avoid violence, it's pretty easy. The structure here is good, so you don't have to choose. I have a medical problem, how do I find a doctor? That's not a crisis. That's essentially solved. At least in the United States, for people who aren't poor, if you need a doctor, you can find a doctor. If you need to avoid criminal violence, in most places at least, it's easy. If you're poor, it's not easy. So what this claim suggests is that people who are doing well partly because they don't have to choose. They have choices made for them. Stop berating people for not being responsible and start to think of ways instead of providing the poor with the luxury that we all have, which is that a lot of decisions are taken for us. If we do nothing, we are on the right track. For most of the poor, if they do nothing, they are on the wrong track. That's an emphasis on the extent to which those who are doing well can choose not to choose, and everything's going to be fine. If you're under struggling or difficult circumstances, if you choose not to choose, you're sick and maybe you're dead. That's the claim. Okay, down the mountain. Remember my little framework about decision costs and error costs? One problem with insisting on choosing is that you impose decision-making burdens on choosers that they would prefer not to incur. Another problem is you put a burden on a planner of setting up a question for people. That may be very costly to do. Under circumstances where the issue is unfamiliar or new, errors are inevitable. To bring the issue down maybe to a problem many nations are facing, there's a question whether it's important to educate people in financial literacy. Is that a familiar idea, to promote financial literacy so people can be like my father and make pretty good investment decisions? The record on financial literacy is not good. The record is that people don't enjoy it and they forget what they learned. So financial literacy imposes high decision costs and doesn't reduce errors. We know also that people tend to recognize other people are biased, but they tend to think that they themselves are not biased. And that suggests a problem with insisting on choosing. So the test is how high are the costs of decisions without a default rule, how high are the costs of errors with or without a default rule, and we'd want to make a distinction between an ice cream store with 70 flavors, that might be a good idea, versus a default menu in a foreign country from which visitors often benefit. If you go to a foreign country and there's a default menu, great. People don't want to have to choose. Okay, now I'm going to give, I promised I'd give you some data. Now I'm going to give you some data. And I want you to guess in your mind, if you would, what Americans would say. Be very interested to know what people here would say. Suppose that over the years your favorite online bookseller has compiled a lot of information about your preferences. It has an algorithm, and it knows what you will buy before you do. Assume the algorithm is highly reliable, that in 99% of cases, it will know what you're going to want. First question, would you choose to enroll in a program in which the seller sends you books that it knows you will purchase and bills your credit card? Assume you can always send the books back. This is a nationally representative survey. 41% of people said yes, 51% no. I think that's doubly noteworthy. First, most people want to make their own decisions. They don't like the algorithm. Second, 41% of people would sign up. That's high. Next question. Would you approve or disapprove if the seller automatically and without your explicit consent enrolls you in this program? The difference is in the first one, you can choose not to choose. In this one, they're just automatically assuming you don't want to choose. 29% said they approve, 71% said they would disapprove. Okay, that's statistically significant, the difference. It suggests that people would be more likely to sign up for automatic purchases than to approve of being signed up without consent, but nearly a third approve. One reason this seems to me useful is that increasingly it's going to be possible to enroll people in this kind of thing, and the question is whether that's a reflection of liberty or a violation of liberty. Next question. Would you approve or disapprove of a system in which a home monitor in your home automatically and without your consent buys goods, toothpaste, toilet paper, routine goods? Would you like that? Only 32% would approve, where 68% say no. Americans don't like that, but a third do. Are Harvard students different? Yes. 69% favor predictive shopping for household goods. Overwhelming majority says, I would choose not to choose with respect to household goods. Is this a Harvard effect? Are Harvard students really busy so they don't want to buy these things? Are they really trusting, or do they find this really boring, buying household goods, whereas most people think it's fine? Or, and this is my hope, my deep hope, it's a youth effect, it's not a Harvard effect, that younger people are more comfortable with, at least with respect to household goods, choosing not to choose, at least if the choice made by the chooser is accurate. I'm hoping it's a youth effect. Don't know. Okay, what does this mean? Do people want autonomy in the sense of choosing not to choose? Okay, I think we need a little matrix. I'm going to give you the matrix right now. The matrix is some choices are fun to make, some are not fun to make. So if you see a matrix, fun here, not fun here. Some are easy and some are hard. So at the top of the little matrix, easy, hard. So we have cases where making a choice is fun and easy. There people are going to want to choose. We have cases where it's not fun and it's hard. People are not going to want to choose in those circumstances. Then we have cases where it's fun but hard. People will probably want to make that choice. Planning a vacation, fun, hard. People are going to want to do that. Maybe for some, making a retirement plan, hard, fun, at least intriguing. Then there's another category, which is the not fun but easy. People probably don't want to do that, but they're not going to hate it. And that matrix, I think, helps give us a sense of when choosing is a good idea and when choosing not to choose is a good idea. Okay, three ideas emerge from this, I think, which is the importance of considering personalization, considering default rules, and considering simplified active choosing. I think I have to explain this a little bit. At Harvard, my institution, you are automatically enrolled in a savings plan, and the savings plan you're enrolled in fits your age. So the savings plan that a 25-year-old is in will not be the same as one a 45-year-old is in, and that's good. If you don't like the plan, you can opt out, but it's personalized. Okay, with respect to simplified active choosing, here's the basic idea. And I'm conscious of the fact that I'm speaking of abstractions, and the number of concrete social situations that the abstract claims fit is very large. You could imagine a situation, couldn't you, where an employer or a government says to you, choose this or choose that, but if you don't want to make a choice, here's the default. Simplified active choosing. So you can choose a healthcare plan, a curriculum for the next year, but if you don't want to choose, here's the default. You can rely on the default if you want. That is often the best approach because it allows people not to choose, but it tells them if they don't want to choose, they have to say that's what they want. It doesn't presume that on their behalf. Okay, I haven't said anything about mandates. I had a conversation with someone here, I won't disclose whether he's in the room, who said, you know, the interesting thing about these choice-preserving approaches for at least some people in Taiwan is that we're more comfortable than at least some Americans are with mandates, that sometimes a mandate is a good idea. And that's very reasonable to be comfortable with mandates, especially when there are effects on third parties. So if you have cases where people are affecting third parties, of course, there will be an argument for a more aggressive approach than I've discussed. The Republican tradition is more comfortable with mandates than at least some forms of the liberal tradition, saying that if we have a process of democratic deliberation that reflects System 2 and an exercise of civic virtue, then a mandate that is carrying out people's aspirations and values, that's fine. We also have behavioral market failures, meaning cases in which people's biases and mistakes will lead them to errors. And in cases like that, mandates might be a good idea. Okay, I'm almost done. We have a framework now for assessing choice making and choosing not to choose. It involves decision costs and error costs. Part of the motivation is that human beings have scarce cognitive resources and limited bandwidth. In saying this, by the way, I'm very alert to the following fact. The World Bank just announced the creation of a global insights team to try to help development with an eye toward behavioral science. And one thing the World Bank is very focused on is the fact that poor people in poor countries, they're plenty smart, but they, like all of us, they have limited time and attention. And to try to devise policies that are helpful for people with limited time and attention is a good idea. Choosing not to choose can be rational, honorable, welfare promoting, and autonomy increasing. Okay, here's a next to last question for you. What is the most precious commodity that members of the human species have? What's number one on the list? You might be thinking love. That's not the right answer. That's the right answer. Time. Second question and the final one. What is the one thing that public officials, lawyers, doctors, probably professors too, most often neglect? At least in countries with which I'm familiar, there's one thing which people in positions of authority don't pay enough attention to. And it is I think the most serious systematic blindness that public officials and other people in authority have. And here it is. Peace of mind. That's what's neglected. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Professor Sunstein, for very challenging and very interesting speech. Now the floor is open. Please discuss and raise your questions. And before raising the question, please identify yourself so that the communication can be conducted easier. Please.
Okay, thanks. Tan Lai, Australian National University. I was wondering, I have this kind of little worry about some of the practical difficulties of personalized default norms, especially on based on demographic information. My worry is about whether this kind of default setting would reinforce gender norms or even prompt people into living up their stereotypes, and that might affect their performances.
That's great. So I'll give you a little more data, which is in the United States, I asked people, what would you think of a default rule by which women take their husband's name when they get married, and men don't take their wives' names on getting married? So the woman switches her name by default, but she can change it. Okay? Americans like that. They approve of that. That is unconstitutional. That would violate our Constitution, and it's connected with your reason. Here's another one I asked Americans. What do you think if men take their wives' last name on marriage and women don't switch their names? Men go to the woman's, that by default. That's the default. What do you think Americans would think about that? They don't like it. They want women by default to take their husband's last name, and they want men to keep their name by default. And that is personalized in the sense that it builds on at least demographic information. And you could even imagine it more refined, where if you actually knew the preferences of men and women with a fair degree of accuracy, you could have a default rule that just tracks that. So you could this is not as ridiculous, I think, as it might seem. If you knew people's browsing habits on the internet, you might well have a good sense of whether they want to change their name when they get married. You know what kind of person they are. And would that be a good idea? Probably not, for your reason, that if you have a default rule that builds on existing sex discrimination, you entrench it, and that's not acceptable. So I agree with you that if you have a personalized default rule that takes, let's say, an area of historic inequality and just says we're going to follow the history of inequality in our defaults, that could be a form of unacceptable discrimination. Yeah, definitely.
More questions, please? Yes.
My name is Liang, and I'm from Academy of Sinica. I have one comment and a question. My comment is that when you talk about that Harvard students likes to give up their choices more than others, I think would it be possible that they think they are more able than other people to handle the risk of giving up this? To choose, not to choose. I mentioned this comment because I think it's an important thing to think about when we think about choosing or not to choose not to choose. But that's not mentioned in your talk, so I wish to listen to your opinion on this. And my second question is that I think there is a significant difference in the number you show that people agree to give up their right. There are more people are willing to give up their right, but less people are willing to give up the option that they choose to give up their right or not.
Right.
But in that case, is this something to do with those criticism on your book, which you mentioned, that they just emphasize on that people should be able to choose. But you mentioned that choosing not to choose is also a freedom.
Okay, those are fantastic questions. So I'll tell you this entire project which you've heard, when I started it, I meant it to be a response to the criticism that nudges are paternalistic in a bad way, and a suggestion that active choosing is a form of paternalism often, and people choose not to choose, and that's fine. But as I've kept working on it, I see the force of the argument for active choosing. And part of the force of the argument for active choosing is that the exercise of the power to choose might in some contexts be more important than the formal opportunity to choose. So what I think I didn't see well enough in nudge was that the opportunity to choose is important, but it isn't equivalent to the exercise of choice. And it is true it is not equivalent. And you're exactly right that the fact that some people would say, yes, I would opt into a system where choices are made for me. I'm okay with that. But I am not okay with their doing it without asking me. That reflects the importance of making the choice whether to choose, rather than having someone assume it, even if the assumption is reasonable given what they know about me. Now, when people say, I am okay with choosing to go into a program where they choose for me, but I'm not okay with them assuming that, is that about individual dignity? I think so. I think they're saying there's an insult to my dignity that they're doing it without asking me first. And in my data on which kinds of nudges people like, no country in the world have I found where people like the following nudge. You are assumed to want to give a certain amount of money to a charity, and your employer is going to take that money out and give it to a charity, but if you don't want that, you can say, I don't want that. No country likes that. That's a little bit surprising, because I would like it, I confess, if my employer gave automatically some money to a charity, and I kind of am sad that because of inertia I don't give as much money as I would like to. It's kind of a Republican thought, but people don't like someone just presuming it. So you are completely correct on that. In terms of the Harvard students and whether it's possible that they can afford this, if you're looking at the slide, it's possible. But I didn't do a demographic test to see whether the Harvard students generally, they have money, so if they end up getting more toothpaste than they want, it's okay, they can afford that. So you may be right, it may be a contributor. My hunch is that for an ordinary person, the idea of going out and shopping for household goods, that's all right. That's not something you are troubled by. But for a Harvard student, they don't like that. They want to be relieved of that. Maybe more people every year will think, so long as I can trust the automatic process, I would welcome the automatic process. So I'm wondering whether the majority objection is they don't trust the bookseller, really, even though I tried to design the question so that they would have to.
Yentu Su from Academia Sinica. I'm just wondering which side you were in on the debate over compulsory voting. So some people think that voting is a choice and you can choose not to vote. But President Obama's thing to weigh in and endorse the idea of compulsory voting, saying that that's a good way to go. So I wonder which side you would in.
I haven't studied it well enough to have a final opinion. So, and of course, one country is different from another. In the United States, I'm inclined to think that we should have automatic registration and make it really easy to vote without requiring people to vote. So some people choose not to vote because they are busy or alienated, or they have a child who's sick at home they have to take care of. And I think that's all right. But I wouldn't make it a crime or punish people for not voting. But to make it really easy for people to vote, as we do not always, that's a very good idea.
Hi, Professor Sunstein. My name is Lin Chunyuan from Zhongyuan University. I have a question similar to Professor Su's questions. My question is about the idea of Republican and the choice of not to choose. Let's say the idea of deliberative democracy is that people exposed to various opinion, information, and we hope them can participate in public discussion and also voting. But my question is, what if citizens choose not to expose themselves to various opinions? They want to ward themselves from different opinions, or they don't like public issues. They don't want to involve in any kind of political conflicts. And how do you think about that? And my second question is about the nudging. If nudging become a very good and successful system, will it actually harm the variety of the society or the deliberation, the process of the democracy? Okay, thank you.
Thank you for those. The second, I think, is a little easier to handle. The first is complicated. Suppose we had a society where there's public education campaigns on obesity and smoking, and I gather here the pack has a very scary warning on a cigarette pack. Australia has been very aggressive in nudging to reduce smoking. It's gotten it down to 12%. If you have efforts to use default rules to promote environmental goals or to make sure people have enough money for difficult circumstances, it should be that if those emerge from a well-functioning democratic process, which satisfies, let's say, modern Republican ideals, that wouldn't sap anything in society. It would extend life, maybe, and combat economic deprivation. The idea of nudges as sapping society's strength and energy, it would have to be very extreme, I think, and not realistic compared to the set of things that nations are considering. So I think the program of nudging is much more modest and pragmatic than would run into grave difficulty on the ground you're rightly concerned about. In terms of republicanism and citizens, we could have two different conceptions of republicanism for starters. One is, let's say, some version of Roman republicanism, which prizes active citizen involvement in everything. Or you could have a different form of republicanism, we could call it representative republicanism, which allows a democratic check, but which says that the deliberative work on most issues is going to be undertaken by representatives, not by citizens themselves. For many nations, at least, the representative version of republicanism is maybe more respectful of the competing demands on people's time, and also more well-suited to just what modern societies are like. So I have a sister, she works in real estate. To ask her, she's a very smart and nice person, to ask her to spend a significant amount of her time focusing on clean air issues or highway safety issues or childhood obesity, that's probably not a good idea for her. And there are many millions of people like that. So if you have representative republicanism, that relieves the pressure on citizens, at least to make deliberative judgments about a wide range of concrete things. So that's good. Still doesn't answer your question, though. If you have representative republicanism, which has ultimate accountability by a at least somewhat engaged citizenry, what do you do if the citizenry is not exposed to many things and is isolated in an echo chamber or something? I think the only thing to do that is to try to have a civic architecture which allows people to hear a lot of things and inculcates a culture which is where individuals are humble about, the limits of their own knowledge. In World War II, an American judge with the improbable name Learned Hand. You wouldn't expect someone to have his first name would be Learned and his last name would be Hand. But there is a judge named Learned Hand. And he was a very great judge. Probably with a name like that, you had to become great at something. And he said during World War II, he said, the spirit of liberty is that spirit which is not too sure that it is right. The spirit of liberty is that spirit which is not too sure that it is right. That's a great sentence. And one reason it's great is that it doesn't say the spirit of liberty is that spirit which is not sure that it's right. Because that would make liberty too weak. Liberty has to have some confidence, not too sure that it's right. But if you can inculcate a culture where people are thinking, at every point, I might be wrong, that can help. I'll give you a story, I think, of American republicanism, where in the early days of our constitutional debate, when we were deciding what the Bill of Rights should have, it was suggested that the First Amendment, which has freedom of speech and freedom of religion, should also have a right to instruct, where citizens would have a right to instruct their leaders what to do. So you could tell your representative, this is how you have to vote. And the argument that defeated that part of the Bill of Rights was, no, the point of a representative system is that people go into the process, hear others, consult, and decide, having heard from others, what is in the best interest of the whole community. A right to instruct would defeat the purpose of the meeting. That was, I think, a good decision not to have a right to instruct, and it suggests, at least at the representative level, when things are working well, and they're not always working well, at least in my country, people listen, and they are not too sure that they're right.
Hendrik Ommerswinkel from National Taiwan University. And so I actually have a plea for you, which is don't call your paper choosers are losers. So and the intuition behind this is the following. Basically, in this literature, and there are by now quite a few papers doing these kind of experiments about let's call it preference for control. There's on the one hand this intuition that they're doing a mistake, right? So they're doing a mistake by choosing to control something which is actually going to give them a worse payoff. But on the other hand, one can interpret it exactly kind of in the liberal tradition, let's say, that they actually deliberately make the choice that they prefer their autonomy, right? So they are actually willing to pay something for their autonomy. And I think they're both interpretations kind of in the literature, but I think every paper needs to kind of account for both of those.
Okay, that's great. So maybe I should have a different title. So I think this is an intriguing question. If people choose under circumstances in which they know that the right to choose leads to lower payoffs for them, what is happening? What's going on? Now, it might be, and in some of the papers, not ours, but in some of the papers, I think it's that people find it fun to gamble. And if they get a payoff that results from their own smart gamble, they enjoy that more than if they got the equivalent money from someone else's smart gamble. So one possibility is that they're thinking the process of winning because of your own choice is more valuable than the payoff. So I'm thinking my mother, who was basically raising her children, occasionally worked and got some money. She was a teacher, and she got some money, and she loved that money. If my father brought home the same amount of money, it wouldn't have any meaning. It was her money. She earned it. And so some of the control stuff is about autonomy in that sense, that you are responsible for your own earning. But some of it, I think you're right, is about a preference for control as such. And in either of those accounts, their choosers are not losers. They are rationally responding to the payoff increase because it's your cleverness, or the payoff value, just it was yours. You did it even if you lost. So I have to go back to our data, which is very complicated. I think it's the case that at least in some of our data, it wasn't fun gambling to do it. And it wasn't control as such, but it might be. We have a bunch of different conditions, and I'm a lawyer. My co-author is does both psychology and neuroscience, so I'll ask her that. She'll know the answer.
Andy Kong, I'm a graduate student at the University of Oxford. I have actually a conceptual question, I hope, which is not too patent to be raised here. I wonder if you would think the moral permissibility of nudging would have to depend on a Republican conception of liberty as opposed to a liberal conception. You mentioned that you mentioned that Republicanism would feel more comfortable with nudging. So I wonder if you have to be a Republican in order to defend, to justify nudging.
I don't think so. I think if you are, okay, so there's one view that the liberal tradition is opposed to the Republican tradition. There's another view that it's possible to be a liberal Republican. That is someone who places an emphasis on self-government and the value of citizen engagement while also respecting liberal ideals. And liberal republicanism seems to me a feasible approach. If you're, let's say, very skeptical of republicanism in general, in any form, and you are a liberal of one or another sort, I think you should be fine with nudging. If you're a liberal, let's say, of the Milton Friedman sort, I think you should be fine with nudging. The only way you wouldn't want nudging in the form of default rules is if you insisted that active choosing is the preferred approach to human life. And I think that's a very hard position to sustain, because if we have to choose actively with respect to everything, there will probably be only one or two things which we will actively choose, and then we'll run out of time. So the liberal prizing of active choosing, as opposed to the opportunity to choose, I think runs aground of limited time and attention. Also the fact that people choose not to choose, and that's a way they exercise their autonomy. So mandates run into liberal concerns when there aren't harms to others. So in a way you're asking, one way to understand what you've said is to engage with John Stuart Mill. So we'll get a little philosophical for a moment, shall we? So there are two ways of engaging with Mill once the behavioral science is taken on board. One way is to say that Mill's arguments for liberty are greatly undermined by the behavioral findings. That Mill's central argument for the harm principle is that choosers are in a better position than outsiders to know what's best for them. That's Mill's number one argument. It's epistemic. It's about knowledge. And Hayek, the great Hayek, in a actually very recently published book, Hayek says that the inevitable ignorance of the planner of what suits the chooser is the chief basis for liberty. I think that's remarkable that Hayek says the chief basis for liberty is that the chooser knows better than the planner. Now, the behavioral findings suggest that Mill and Hayek might be wrong, that choosers, at least in some contexts, show systematic biases. They make mistakes. And that raises a very serious problem for Mill and Hayek. So there's a terrific book, I believe, by someone named Conley, C-O-N-L-Y, a philosopher. I think she counts as a liberal, but the subtitle of her book, I think, is in support of coercive paternalism on essentially liberal grounds. That's one direction. I don't agree with that direction. I think the preference for freedom of choice emerges even after the encounter with behavioral science, which would say that the reason a liberal should be fine with nudges is they're unavoidable. You can't not nudge. And in circumstances in which a nudge is voluntary, the government decides to nudge, it doesn't, it could avoid, let's say, a warning on a cigarette pack. It's hard, I think, to defend a conception of liberalism that objects to a system in which people see vigorous warnings, but ultimately they can smoke if they want. So what form of liberalism would say you can't have a warning or a reminder or a default rule?
Good afternoon, Professor. I'm Shou from National Taiwan University, and I have a question regarding the nudge designing stuff, because according to the concept we have perceived, the nudge itself is basically an ability to shape the appearance of a country, or at least a citizen of the country. So how do we generate the qualified nudge designers or nudge architects to know what kind of nudge you were designing, because it's, after all, a very great power? Thank you.
Okay, so I worked in the U.S. government, and there are a few things we did. There's a website you can find called data.gov, and it gives a lot of information to the world. Some of the information is about government's own performance. So it's a way of using visibility it's choice architecture for the choice architect. You can also find, though I don't recommend that you do, you can also find regulations.gov and reginfo.gov. These are websites completely available to the world, which basically give visibility to everyone into the regulations that are coming from the United States government. That's choice architecture for choice architects. It's designed to say to the government that's designing default rules and other architects, you have to show what you're doing to the public, take comments from the public, and respond to comments from the public. There's also a requirement that President Obama insisted on, that every expensive regulation has to be accompanied by an analysis of the costs and benefits. So if you have a nudge, you have to show how much is it going to cost and what are the benefits going to be. And if the benefits don't justify the cost, then it's in some trouble. And the benefit cost analysis is itself subject to public scrutiny. I found that for the United States, the latter form of choice architecture to constrain the nudgers, which is careful requirement of cost-benefit analysis, is extremely valuable. Because otherwise you might be doing nudges that impose burdens and don't do anything good, and you might be avoiding nudges that are extremely helpful. So the focus on a very disciplined analysis with the help of economists and scientists, something like this academy to go into government and help inform choices, that can be great.
I'm Raghu from National Chengchi University. I was wondering whether there is a difference between active choices and choices where you choose not to choose in terms of status. More specifically, I refer to having the choice not to choose a candidate on a voting while you're voting. I want to know your thoughts on that.
Okay, that's great. So I was thinking for most of the talk that active choosing is different from a default rule. That's true, I think, that active choosing, a default rule allows you to choose passively, and active choosing forces you to register your will. But you can, of course, and I don't think I was clear enough about this, you can make an active choice not to choose, and that is not passive at all, and that is honorable and often right. So when the cab driver says to me, what route do you want to take, I don't just stare at him angrily. I say, you choose. That's an active choice. Okay, you could imagine on a ballot, definitely, a choice not to choose where you could say none of the above. And maybe not even going to the voting booth is a way of saying none of the above, though it's less articulate. If you say none of the above, you're registering your opposition to the choices. If you don't show up, you might be saying, I don't like the choices, or you might be saying, I want to spend time with my friends. So yes, an active choice and a choice not to choose can be analogous if the choice not to choose is itself active.
Hello, Professor. I'm Wei Jiao Chuan from graduate school student of law college in National Taipei University. And mentioning about the regulation, I would like to talk about the gun control regulation in United States, which has already been the most urgent and serious problem in the United States. But that is an issue which is very unfamiliar in Taiwan, because people in Taiwan have no choices of possessing the guns or transactions of the guns, because that would be a very serious crime in Taiwan. So what would I like to ask is about what should be the choices of the United States Americans to the gun control problems, because it seems to be a issue between the human life and security and the benefits of the gun transaction of the arms selling companies. Thank you.
Okay, great. It's a very intensely debated issue in the United States. Okay, here I'll give you three views, and I'll tell you which one I like best. So one view is that there's a constitutional right to have guns, and that on balance, that's very good, and that when people have guns, there's actually less violence because the criminals know that someone might shoot them. So one view, which a number of Americans hold, is that gun control should not be welcomed because it's unconstitutional and it is not going to promote the public safety goal. I think you probably know I don't agree with that view, but there are people I respect who think that. There's another view, which is that our Constitution actually doesn't protect an individual right to have guns, and that it would be highly desirable and constitutionally acceptable for the United States to go in the direction of Taiwan and I guess Australia, to have a massive effort to eliminate guns from our society. I respect a number of people who have that view, but I don't agree with them either. I think for our country, the view that's the best is basically President Obama's, which is that for reasons of culture and possibly reasons of law, we have settled on a commitment to an individual right to have guns. And that's okay. What's not okay is if we have a system where people who get guns may be mentally ill, may be fanatical, may be unstable in one way or another, and that causes not infrequent deaths. And on that view, which is President Obama's view, we can respect the individual right to have guns while having stronger regulatory safeguards to make sure that the people who have guns are not people who might shoot their fellow citizens. That third view seems to me correct, and it's, I think, quite unfortunate and in many ways surprising that our government as a whole hasn't agreed to the third position. Note that if you agree with the third position, you will think that some forms of regulation would involve nudges, where either education or default rules of various sorts could be part of the set of protections to make sure that people who, if they have guns, might kill people with them, don't get guns.
Professor Sunstein, I'm a graduate student from Zhengzhou University. I would like to ask you a question about Obamacare. I'm wondering that is there any areas that the policy tool need not only nudge but coercive mandate, that for conservatives don't want to get into the exchange, but in the policies such as public insurance or universal insurance, that everyone in the risk pool is a very important aspect to maintain the system.
Yes, okay, so that's great and makes what we're discussing very practical. So one view, which actually Senator Obama held during the campaign, was we should not require people to have health insurance. We should have automatic enrollment in health insurance subject to opt-out. Very much like what we're now discussing. And some of the Republicans at the time and now are saying exactly that. There should not be an individual mandate. People should be free not to have health insurance if they don't want to, but they should have automatic enrollment in health insurance. I think your argument is convincing, that if people are not required to get health insurance, then the risk pool is going to be very problematic, because the people who have health insurance will be the people who are mostly susceptible to being sick, and that will undo the system. It's also the case that if people don't have health insurance and then get sick, the government isn't going to let them die. It's not going to be that they're going to come into the hospital and say, sorry, you don't have health insurance and you can't pay. So someone's going to have to pay, which means that those who don't get health insurance are, in effect, forcing other people to pay for them. They are not making a self-regarding act. So the individual mandate, as it's called, for health insurance seems to me on balance justified.
The idea of choosing not to choose. I think this kind of actor is actually not opposed to the active chooser. It seems to be a kind of chooser actor which is active, passive chooser, right? You active choose not to choose, so you are active, passive. Okay, so we now have 4 categories: active, 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 passive, passive, active, and passive, passive. Right. And I see the power of the default rule argument is actually more congenial to passive, active rather than active, passive. Do that make sense? Right. But you seem to be arguing for the active, passive rather than passive, active. Right. Thanks.
So you think I'm arguing for people to be permitted actively to choose not to choose, and I'm not and that's true, I am arguing for that, for honoring the active choice not to choose as something people do, but I'm not arguing for what's the thing I'm not arguing for?
For the passive active. Passive active is that you assume default choice.
Oh, good.
And
Excellent.
then you choose not to opt out, right? I think the power of the default choice is for the passive active.
I see.
Rather than for the active passive. Thanks.
I see. Does this help that in some situations people don't actively choose not to choose? An institution just assumes that that's what they do if they were asked, and to ask them defeats the point. So, yeah. So is that the kind of what you're saying? Okay, excellent. Okay, good. That's a very valuable clarification. That it's maybe easiest for me to say that in circumstances in which people actively choose not to choose, we should respect their choice. And I think it's hard to argue with that. But you're drawing attention to the fact that frequently default rules are in place because the government thinks they would choose a default rule, and if we ask them, do you want a default rule, then we ruin everything because we're asking them, and they don't want that question. If you ask people, do you want a default rule for this and this and this in your relationship with your employer, you might think, stop asking me questions. I don't want those questions. Okay, yes, so I would suggest, this probably wasn't clear enough, that for the reason you give, that the assumption that people would choose not to choose is often correct, and to force them to register their will to that effect is doing them no good. So to make this a little more concrete, if a doctor says to you, when you're very sick and stressed, say, there are 5 treatments, which do you want? And you say, please, what do you think? And the doctor says, well, I want you actively to choose the default, which is this. This is what most people do. This is what I do. And you go again, no. You might want the doctor to say, this is what I recommend. Let's do it. I'm smiling a little bit at this example because I have a new book that I'm working on now, and I have a very unusual editor. She's very directive. She would let me do what I want always, but she says, this is what we're going to do. She is assuming that I want her to make various decisions that aren't about the content of the book, but are about things related to design and marketing. That's great. I'm pleased that she's doing that. So you're making a very helpful clarification that assuming that people want not to choose is often correct. And notice that 29% of people in the United States said they would approve of automatically enrolling them in the algorithm for books, and that 29% is likely to grow over time as people have experience with accurate algorithms.
Chen Junji from German University for Administrative Science, Speyer. I have 2 questions. One is related to the theoretical presumption. You have mentioned there are 3 sources of freedom of choice. The first is welfare, then dignity, and then autonomy. And I'm interested in this categorical differentiation because you have mentioned utilitarianism and the ontological approach from Kant. But as far as I know, Kant, in the conception of Kant, the notion of autonomy is intrinsic to the notion of dignity. So I'm just interested in why do you make a difference from the dignity and autonomy? Is there any implication? And
that's good. And you could think that if you're a deontological person, that dignity and autonomy are the same thing, and that there should be two categories. I think it's useful to make this distinction, and here's why. That the antonym of dignity, I think, is humiliation and not coercion. So there can be an insult to dignity that doesn't compromise autonomy. If people are treated as children in terms of how they are spoken to, they might feel that they've been subject to an indignity, even if their autonomy hasn't been interfered with. So we can imagine a government that treats people as if they are incompetent. And it says you can do whatever you want, but it's acting as if they are babies, infants. That would be an insult to their dignity, and there'd be no coercion involved. I mean, we could have a conception of autonomy which maybe has Kant's ideas at the foundation, such that an insult to dignity and an insult to autonomy would this be the same thing. But I do think in ordinary language they're different. You could have an act of coercion that compromises people's autonomy that doesn't insult their dignity. It might be to try to prevent harm to third parties, but it does interfere with their autonomy. So there's no indignity, I don't think, in being told that you're not allowed to emit certain levels of pollution. That's coercive. Your autonomy is violated, but there's no indignity there. Some kinds of nudges that bother people preserve autonomy, but they insult dignity. Now, as I say, you're right that you could have a conception of autonomy such that the thing that non-coercive things insult people's autonomy. But I think it's useful to have this distinction, even if there's a convincing Kantian objection that the distinction isn't quite right.
I still have another question to me. I didn't finish. My second question is related to the three categories of impersonal default, impersonalized default, and active choice. It seems to me related to these three categories is a thought of personal or material questions, like health and personal decision. But sometimes our decision is not directly related to such substantial or material question, but to a sort of procedural question, like I got notice to participate at public hearing, but even if I choose not to participate, the final decision is not definitely or not absolutely influenced on me. So my question is, are there any difference between this procedural decision or the procedural related decision and the substantial oriented decision, in your opinion? Thank you.
Answer to that offhand, so I'll talk about it a little bit. You might think that with respect to certain intimate choices, active choosing has large advantages, and maybe they're decisive advantages. So if the question involves who you're going to marry, or what your religion is, or what your political convictions are, and it's very interesting to think what else belongs on that list, we would need, that's a substantive choice that has a degree of intimacy, we'd have a presumption in favor of active choosing. And it may be that that's decisive. That, of course, cultures vary on this count, but you might think that if a private or public institution decided we're going to have a personalized default rule for you about your spouse, you could opt out, but this is going to be it, unless you opt out. We might think that that violates one or more of the three principles. Yes? Okay. So if it's very accurate, then on welfare grounds it's okay. And I'm thinking a little bit about the question about control, which would be very relevant to certain intimate choices. On the procedural ones, offhand, it might be the same framework. So if a notice of a public hearing and the person who sends you the notice is sending it to everybody, it would be an impersonal default rule. It's a community, there's a public hearing on something. Or if it's personalized, that you get it because the person knows that this is something you care about and maybe your neighbor doesn't. Or it's framed in a way that reflects your own stake in it and someone else gets a different one. That offhand, it would raise the same kinds of questions about decision costs and error costs, but I might be missing something there.
Given that this is the second consecutive speech delivered by Professor Sunstein, so perhaps we take one or two more questions. The first one and the last three questions, or together and respond for at the same time. That would be saving time. Would that be okay?
What was just done, mind you, is an illustration of the value of personalized defaults. If he had asked me what do I want to happen, I would have said I have no idea. Anything's fine. But he chose a personalized default. He started by saying I'd given another talk. So there, take that.
About the response to the first problem about the experiment, I wonder if there is some effect from age, from gender, or some generation. For example, in Taiwan, it's common just 60 years ago that women take family name from her husband. Sorry. And the derived question is that if you set impersonal default or a personalized default, will that just make the heterogeneous population impossible? That's my question. Thank you.
Now you're making me make an active choice, and we know I don't want that. No, I'm happy to. So on the generational question with respect to women's names and demographic differences, we were very careful. This hasn't been published yet. I should say my research assistant and I, very careful to check one demographic characteristic, which is the gender difference. I expected that men would be very negative about the idea that men take women's names, and men would be very positive about the idea that women take men's names, and that women would be a bit different, that some women would think that's kind of cool, that men take women's names, and women would resist the idea that women take men's names. There was no gender difference. They were identical. So the percentages we got with respect to Americans want women to take men's names by default, Americans do not want men to take women's names by default. On both of those questions, the most noteworthy demographic characteristic, gender, had no explanatory power, exactly the same. We tried to look at age and didn't find much. That's surprising to me. I'll go back and look at it. But the data didn't clearly show a statistically significant difference with respect to age. That is surprising.
Now, by my personalized default, so pose the last two questions, then ask Professor Sunstein to respond.
Dear Professor, my name is Davey. I come from Guangzhou. I have two questions I want to ask you. First, I have read your book's name, Getting Beyond Good Things to Make Groups Smarter. And according to your research, you say please don't speak too much good words and don't be more positive. I have a little puzzle about this. Can you tell me why? And second question is individual questions. As we know, you seem like a Superman. You're good at every area, subjects, and professionals. So can you give some tips, practical or useful tips can help us to improve ourselves, can combine different subjects and different area? Thank you.
Last question, I remember one gentleman raised that. Yes.
My name is Fan Yangxian. I'm a graduate student from the Furen Catholic Unity. My question is about the default rule. I think it is possible or risky in the politics. I think everybody knows IKEA, so I use IKEA to explain my question. The IKEA effect is a special marketing technique because their customer to buy their furniture, but they assemble their own furniture. They make a furniture not so useful because it's easy to break. So I think this is one kind of possible if the IKEA effect become a default rule in the political, and that would be very hard to understand that risky.
Okay, I'm not sure I fully understood that, but I think I understood enough of it. So IKEA, is that well known here, the store IKEA? I've been in an IKEA store once, and I almost had a nervous breakdown. And the fact that I didn't go to a therapist for the next 5 years in light of my distress and trauma is, I think, a tribute to my parents who created a certain resilience such that I could survive the IKEA experience. This is a way of saying that, at least for some of us, IKEA involves a form of choice architecture which imposes extremely high decision costs. Now, it's a successful business model, so it must be that for some people the high decision costs are worth incurring, either because assembling the product is fun or because it's sufficiently inexpensive that it's worth it. But you're asking whether the IKEA model in the political process. Okay, that's a very interesting analogy. If there are certain forms of republicanism, I'm not sure if this is the Roman form, but there are certain modern understandings which really do see citizens devising government in the IKEA way, that they are assembling it by their own hands. And for reasons that some people in the liberal tradition have emphasized, that's not a good division of labor, that citizens have multiple conceptions of the good, that to think of their own lives as about chemistry or physics or family or banking rather than about government, that's completely fine. And so a liberal form of republicanism certainly prizes democratic control, but it doesn't insist on the IKEA model for the polity. So that's a possible direction of an answer, at least. In terms of the earlier question, so the book on groupthink, the claim there for leaders is that it's very good for leaders to be quiet so that they can elicit information from other people. And that is true in universities, in business, in government. So when I was in my job in the White House, after I got confirmed by the Senate on my first week, my staff, I had a very excellent staff, they'd ask me what I thought about various issues, and I would say, this is what I think, and they'd be completely quiet. And they'd act as if what I had said was correct. But I didn't know what I was talking about. It was my first week. They had worked there for years, sometimes decades. And so I saw close hand what the academic research also shows, which is if a leader expresses a view too clearly and too confidently, then you will suppress the acquisition of information from others. And so I learned that the best thing to do was to be very quiet, because that way I'd get the information that people had and my decision would be informed. President Obama, by the way, is superb at this. In meetings often, he will make clear he wants everyone to talk first before he talks, so that he gets their information. And the data, which is in the book, is that that's generally how good leadership works. Not always. If you have a leader who really knows that we should do this tomorrow, then for the leader to say, we're going to do this tomorrow is a good idea. But that form of leader might deprive himself or herself of information from the group. Thank you for your kind words about my writing on my computer. I think that the best advice I ever saw anyone give was given by my co-author Richard Thaler, who in a graduate speech was explaining why he became a behavioral economist when no one else was doing behavioral economics. And he said his advisors said to him, why are you doing this terrible thing? Your career is going to fail. There's no such thing as behavioral economics. Do regular economics. And he said there were two reasons he didn't follow that advice. One was he wasn't very good at math, so he couldn't do regular economics. And the other is he really loved the behavioral material. He loved it. And he said, even if it had failed, at least he would have spent time doing something that he loved. And loving what you're doing is the best hedge, he said. So when I think of things I work on, when they haven't worked out poorly, it's because I've loved doing it. And even if it ends up not being so good, at least I would have enjoyed it. And if you love what you're doing, whether it's interdisciplinary or not, that's the best clue to whether it's going to work out.
Thank you very much, Professor Sunstein, for giving us such a wonderful speech based on the most recent research and respond to various questions from the audience. And please join me in a big applause for Professor Sunstein for his speech.